At 25, orphaned and dust-covered, Evelyn Vance stood alone in a valley where there had been no water for 50 miles, with red grit in the seams of her boots and a white sun burning above a dead river that had once carried her whole world. Across that ruined basin there hung another presence, even when he was nowhere in sight: Garrison Croft, the silent monster in a pressed black coat, the man whose greed had dried the valley to bone and helped send her mother and father into the grave one slow sorrow at a time. So when she crossed the yard at Dry River and paid a handful of silver for the wreck everyone feared and mocked, when she laid claim to the towering, sun-baked steamship called the Iron Monarch as it leaned in a cracked riverbed like a stranded beast of iron and memory, the town said loneliness had finally split her mind. They did not know that inside that dark metal belly waited a secret capable of bringing gold, justice, and the sound of rushing water back to the dry basin. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Evelyn. If you are watching from a place that feels forgotten or quiet tonight, tell us in the comments below. There had been a time, before the dust taught the valley new names for hunger, when Evelyn knew the river as a living thing, broad-backed and brown-green, shouldering past willow roots and cottonwood shadows, carrying foam in spring and moonlight in summer, breathing fog into the mornings and silver into the night. In those days the dry river basin had not been dry at all, though no one had yet thought to rename it. It had been a long bowl of fertile earth cupped between red clay bluffs and blue mountain shoulders, with small farms quilted along the banks and skiffs tied to pilings, and the whistle of steamers coming up from the south to trade flour, tools, lamp oil, fabric, seed, coffee, and news. Evelyn's father, Thomas Vance, belonged to that world as if steam itself had chosen him. He was the chief engineer of the Iron Monarch in its proud years, a broad-handed man with soot always worked into the lines of his palms and a gentleness in him that made children and machinery trust him equally. He smelled of river damp, pine tar, hot iron, and tobacco leaf that he never quite found time to smoke. When Evelyn was small, he would lift her onto a crate in the engine room and show her how power moved through the body of a vessel, how the boilers fed the pistons, how the pistons drove the shaft, how the great stern wheel bit the current and answered the pilot's hand. He taught her to listen before she looked. Every machine, he would say, tells on itself if we are patient. A loose rod chatters one way. A tired bearing complains another. A pressure line whispers before it bursts. He showed her river charts spread on the kitchen table, their pencil marks and depth notations like secret scripture, and he taught her to read them as other girls were taught embroidery patterns or hymns. Her mother, Clara, laughed that the child would grow up with more iron dust than flour on her hands, but even she would pause to watch Thomas and the little girl bending over blueprints by lamplight, and something bright and proud would rise in her face. Then came the year the river vanished. That at first it did not vanish all at once. It withdrew by degrees, like a wounded creature backing into shadow. Sandbars that had once hidden beneath the surface appeared in the middle channel. Fish flopped in warm shallows. Barges scraped bottom where they had always floated free. Men on porches said it was a dry season and would pass. Ranch wives studied the horizon with narrowed eyes. Thomas Vance returned from trips upriver with worry lodged behind his silence. He had seen fresh cuttings in the mountain timber, he said. He had seen crews where no crews should be, mule trains hauling lumber and iron into side canyons not marked for any lawful work. He was not yet the unquestioned baron he would become, but he had money, land hunger, and the polished patience of a man willing to wait while others starved. He began buying notes, then mortgages, then whole fields. When wells failed and crops shriveled and freight stopped, he offered loans against land that had fed families for decades. When the loans came due, he took the farms. Always he wore concern like a Sunday coat. Always he spoke softly. Always he insisted the valley needed consolidation, efficiency, modern management, wiser hands. Men one blistering week and came back with torn sleeves, bruised ribs, and a look Evelyn would never forget. He told Clara in a low voice, thinking the child asleep, that there was a dam under construction in a hidden gorge above the basin, a crude and monstrous thing of cribbed timber, blasted stone, and iron gates, built not for irrigation in common but for diversion. Water was being turned through private channels toward Croft's holdings beyond the ridge. The basin had been starved on purpose. He meant to bring proof. He meant to speak before the county board and the circuit judge when next they came through. But truth in a frontier valley can be made to travel slower than money. One of the men who had gone with him disappeared into another territory. The other swore he had seen nothing. Thomas kept working what little repair jobs remained, his steamboat stranded with the rest, his wages gone. Clara took in mending until candle wax ran onto her fingertips. Fever came through that winter, made meaner by hunger and bad water. Evelyn lost her mother first, then her father by spring, when a boiler accident at a salvage camp was blamed on carelessness by men who knew better. She was 15. By 16 she was alone except for debts, old tools, and the river knowledge that had nowhere to go. In the years that followed, Croft's empire rose exactly where other lives were sinking. He fenced what had once been open commons. He bought the orchard rows for pennies, the grain fields for dimes, the empty houses for lumber. The farmers who remained did so by stubbornness, hauling barrels from distant springs, scratching beans and squash from the margins of failure, watching the basin turn from brown-green wealth to a hard bright theater of dust. The Iron Monarch remained where she had died, tilted in the old channel, her hull bleaching under the fierce western sun, her iron plates rusting to the color of dried blood, her paddle wheel crying out whenever the desert wind blew through it at dusk. Children dared one another to climb her gangway. Drifters camped in her shade and left in a hurry. Old-timers crossed themselves when they passed. They said ships belonged to water, and anything that stayed too long on dry land began to remember the dead. Evelyn remembered something else. She remembered her father's hands on a wrench, steady and certain. She remembered the way his voice changed when he spoke of machines worth saving. And she remembered, too, the look on his face after the mountains, the look of a man who had seen a crime too large to fit inside ordinary speech. By 1893 she had outlived nearly everyone's expectations for her and earned little from it except calluses. She mended harness buckles, fixed hand pumps, sharpened plow teeth, and spent nights in a lean-to behind the abandoned cooperage. When the county posted notice that the Iron Monarch, long considered derelict salvage, would be sold for whatever sum could be got from fool or dreamer, men laughed over the paper until tears ran into their whiskers. The boiler was shot, they said. The hull was a coffin. The ship could never float again because there was no water to float in even if God himself repaired her. Evelyn came anyway with $3 silver, $2 half-dollars, and the last brass watch key her father had ever carried. The clerk looked at her, then at the ship, then back at her as though choosing which madness to respect. When the paper was signed, a ripple of amusement moved through the room. Somebody asked if she planned to sail to California on dust. Somebody else offered her a bucket in case she found an ocean in the hold. She did not answer them. She folded the bill of sale carefully and slipped it into the lining of her dress. By sundown she had moved into the pilot house with a bedroll, a water jug, a skillet, a toolbox, and a shotgun so old it seemed more ceremonial than useful. The pilot house windows, though grit-etched and cracked at the edges, still looked over the entire basin. From that height the old river path showed itself as a pale scar curving through the valley floor, bordered by collapsed docks, dead reeds, and the skeletons of cottonwoods that had not tasted deep water in 20 years. Heat rose off the clay in wavering curtains through the afternoon, and by night the iron underfoot released stored sun in long slow breaths. Wind moved through the spokes of the paddle wheel with a hollow moan that sometimes rose into a metallic keening, as if the ship were trying to remember the pitch of its own whistle. She made a home inside ruin with the patient dignity of the truly poor. She swept dust from the chart room and hung her father's brass dividers beside the wheel. She patched one wall of the pilot house with canvas. She carried up crates for shelves. She cleaned a speaking tube no one else believed still connected to anything. Some evenings the basin glowed copper beneath the dying light, and the Iron Monarch cast a shadow as large as a courthouse across the cracked riverbed. Seen from below, she looked impossible, her blackened ribs and rusted stacks towering over the waist like the fossil of some mechanical age that had ended without explanation. Then the ringing began. It came close to midnight on the third night, a sharp metallic note from deep inside the hull, not loud but clean, as if a hammer had lightly touched a pipe somewhere below the furnace deck. Evelyn sat up on her bedroll at once. The basin was full of wind, but this was not wind. She listened. Nothing. Then again, 3 notes together, thin and deliberate. She lit her lamp and went down. The stairs into the lower decks held heat like banked coals. Dust lay thick on the treads, and the air changed as she descended, growing less like desert and more like old engine rooms, with trapped odors of soot, iron scale, stale oil, mouse nesting, and the faint mineral scent of rust sweating in darkness. Her lantern threw long wavering bars of gold over pipes, gauges, riveted walls, and the hulking shapes of the boilers. Here the ship still felt most alive to her. Even broken, it remembered its purpose. Even silent, it seemed on the verge of labor. She searched for an hour and found nothing except a loose hanger tapping now and then under the draft of an unseen seam. Yet the next night the ringing came again, and this time it was followed by something stranger, a hollow shudder through the floor beneath the starboard furnace, so slight that another person might have missed it, but not Thomas Vance's daughter. Machines tell on themselves if we are patient. By daylight she began a systematic inspection. She crawled through ash compartments, opened warped access panels, and scraped soot from plates whose bolts had not seen a wrench in 20 years. The starboard furnace front had a cast iron frame wider than its twin by nearly the breadth of a hand. That alone would have caught her eye. Behind its brick lining she found newer mortar than any surrounding structure should have had. Not new, exactly, but newer. Hidden work. Deliberate work. Her pulse sharpened. She tapped the wall. Solid in one place, hollow in another. For 2 days she chipped and pried whenever the sun was highest and Crofts' riders least likely to notice labor on the ship. Brick by brick the false backing came away. Behind it lay an iron plate no larger than a wardrobe door, sealed at the edges. And in the center of that plate was a recessed fitting shaped to take a square key. She had no key. But she had her father's tools and his habits. Around the fitting were scratches so fine most eyes would have missed them, the kind made by repeated use under hurry and secrecy. She fashioned a square bite from a broken socket head, sleeved it over the watch key stem, and turned with both hands. At first nothing moved. Then there came an internal click, followed by the deep tired exhale of bolts surrendering after a generation. The plate swung inward on hidden hinges, the lantern flame jumped. Beyond the false furnace wall was a narrow vault, dry and close, lined with shelves wrapped in oilcloth that had preserved more than the desert had managed to steal. On the lower shelf sat canvas sacks tied with wire and sealed in wax. When Evelyn opened the first, her breath caught so sharply the sound nearly seemed to belong to someone else. Raw gold gleamed back at her in blunt irregular bars and heavy coins bundled in paper rolls, the kind of wealth that makes lamplight look poor. Not treasure in the storybook sense, bright and carefree, but hard condensed power, hidden where fire would keep prying hands away. On the shelf above lay document tubes, deed packets, survey maps, notarized land patents bearing dates from before the river's disappearance. Evelyn spread them carefully on an overturned coal bin. Many carried the names of families she had known in childhood, names Croft now held title over by foreclosure or forced sale. Yet these earlier patents showed irregularities that made her skin prickle. Boundary lines had been altered in later filings. Water rights had been reassigned through shell claims. Signatures were duplicated in the same clerk's hand. Whole parcels had been consolidated under emergency powers that, according to the sealed originals before her, had never legally applied to this basin at all. And beneath those, wrapped in waxed linen, she found the heart of it, engineering plans. They were drawn in a style she knew intimately, all measurements precise, gates labeled, timber loads calculated, sluice fall estimates marked in the margins. But the hand was not her father's. It was the hand of a survey engineer hired by Croft and too honest, perhaps too frightened, to destroy his own record. There on the pages was the hidden mountain dam in full confession, its placement in a gorge above the natural headwaters, its diversion works, its private channels turning river flow away from the basin and toward Croft's downstream reservoirs beyond the ridge. Tucked inside the final sheet was a letter, unsigned, naming kickbacks to officials and warning that if the emergency release system ever failed, the dam could crack under spring runoff and drown every settlement below the ridge. There must always be a manual lever at the gate control, it said, and a redundant linkage kept off the official ledger. Never leave the basin records in the office. Keep them in the vessel cache until acquisition is complete, vessel cache. Croft had hidden his fraud inside the Iron Monarch because no one imagined value could remain inside a grounded relic, and because the ship had once been under Thomas Vance's care, making it the last place anyone would suspect him of storing the evidence that ruined that family. Whether Croft meant to retrieve it later or had simply forgotten amid the growth of his empire, Evelyn could not know. But there was more. At the rear of the vault, behind the rolled plans, a rod disappeared through the hull wall into a boxed mechanism of gears and tension springs. She cleaned the grime from its brass tag and read the stamped words twice before belief would settle: emergency gate release transfer, auxiliary. She followed the rod with her fingers. It ran upward through a pulley assembly and into the speaking tube shaft she had cleaned in the pilot house. Her father had known. Or at least he had suspected enough to keep something open. This ship had once carried not only passengers and freight but a hidden remote linkage, likely intended as a discreet test or release signal when the dam was first built. It would not open the mountain gates from 50 miles away by magic. No, it was more clever and more dangerous than that. According to the plans, a transmitted counterweight trigger inside the ship could trip a lock sequence that left the upper release lever unsecured for a single interval, but only if the receiving assembly at the dam remained intact. Someone at the dam would still have to face the lever itself. Yet it meant Croft's system had a weakness, a timed vulnerability built into it by engineers who trusted mechanical redundancy more than land barons. Evelyn sat in the boiler room until the lamp burned low, surrounded by gold, land patents, and proof of a theft so large it had changed the weather of a whole valley. For a little while she did not feel triumphant. She felt very small beneath the weight of time, grief, and possibility. Then she thought of her mother stitching by candle end. She thought of her father coming home from the mountains with fear lodged in his silence. She thought of the farms taken, the wells gone bitter, the children raised where river songs had once been. And somewhere inside her, resolve gathered itself like storm water behind a gate. Word travels in dry places faster than mercy. By the next afternoon Croft knew she had found something. Perhaps a clerk talked. Perhaps one of his hired watchers saw her carrying tubes and papers to the pilot house. Perhaps greed simply has its own animal sense. Near sunset a line of riders emerged from the heat haze, black shapes wavering at first, then hardening into horses, dusters, rifles, and the upright familiar posture of men too long obeyed. Garrison Croft rode in the center on a dark gelding, hat brim flat as judgment, face smooth and unreadable. Then Mrs. Bell, who had buried 2 sons and lost 3 acres of peach trees to the drought, came beside him. Then the Turner brothers. Then a dozen more. No one shouted at first. They simply stood there, plain people in worn hats and work dresses, forming a human brace between Croft and the woman above him on the ship. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the long-delayed sound of fear changing sides. Croft tried again, now speaking to the crowd, calling Evelyn a liar, a scavenger, an unbalanced orphan chasing her father's old delusions. At that, something like pain crossed several faces, because many of them remembered Thomas Vance and the day the river failed. Evelyn untied the rope in her hand and lowered a satchel to the deck below. Inside it were copies she had spent the afternoon making with carbon sheet and cramped fingers. Not all the proof, never that, but enough. She told them there were originals for the judge, copies for the newspapers in the rail towns, and 1 packet already hidden beyond Croft's reach. That last part was a bluff, but the basin did not know it, and neither, in that moment, did he. He stared at her with the naked coldness of a man seeing his own future narrow. Then he backed down the gangway 1 step at a time beneath the eyes of people he had believed permanently bent. By full dark, riders were already heading out in opposite directions with copies of the plans wrapped in oilcloth under their shirts. Justice on the frontier rarely arrives clean. It comes dusty, delayed, argued over in hot rooms, bought at cost by those least able to afford the time. But once the county court saw the original patents, once the circuit judge read the engineer's letter and compared the false filings, once the territorial paper printed sketches of the hidden dam and names of the officials who had signed away a river, Croft's empire began to crack exactly where it had once seemed strongest. Liens were frozen. Sales were voided. Deputies rode to seize records. Men who had smiled beside Croft at public banquets discovered sudden loyalty to the truth. The gold from the vault, traced through missing ledgers and unreported acquisitions, was held as evidence, then partially released to fund restitution. It did not heal the dead, but it gave the living tools again. The hardest task was the dam. A party of engineers, deputies, and valley men rode into the mountains with Evelyn among them, carrying the plans inside a tin case and climbing through sun-whitened pine, loose shale, and canyons where the air still smelled faintly of water hidden somewhere just out of sight. By then spring melt had begun to gather behind Croft's illegal works, pressing dark and immense against the gate timbers. The structure crouched in the gorge like a clenched jaw, larger than Evelyn had imagined when first hearing of it as a girl. At the control shed they found the auxiliary receiving assembly still in place, corroded but recognizable. Her father had been right to worry. The whole contrivance was both cunning and unstable. They used the ship plans and the control notes from the vault to release the lock sequence safely. Then, with cables run and braces set, the engineers disengaged the diversion and opened the rightful channels back toward the basin. At first the sound was modest, a thick rush inside stone. Then it deepened. Then the gorge answered with a roar so old and powerful it seemed less like water moving than history remembering itself. Down in the valley, people gathered along the old river path and waited in a heat that had defined 20 years of their lives. We imagine that waiting still, hats in hands, children on wagon tongues, elders seated in chairs carried out to the bank, everybody staring toward the northern bend where only dust usually came. The first sign was not visible but audible, a distant living thunder under the wind. Then birds rose from the dead reeds. Then a dark line appeared in the channel. Shouldering around the curve, carrying foam, twigs, mountain cold, and the shattered reflections of a sky that suddenly seemed much too large to have been absent all those years, the river did not arrive politely. It came like a homecoming delayed beyond all reason. It filled side cuts, soaked the cracked clay, lifted old weed roots, swirled around the tilted hull of the Iron Monarch, and wrapped her iron body in moving light. People cried openly. Some laughed. Some dropped to their knees and put both hands into the current as if greeting a returned relative. Evelyn stood on the deck of her ship, boots damp for the first time in her adult life, and watched brown-green water slap gently against plates that had waited 2 decades to hear that sound again. The ship would never be exactly what she had been before, but that was not the point. With restitution money, labor freely given, and Evelyn's own fierce practical mind, the Iron Monarch became the center of the valley's rebirth. Its lower deck turned into storage for grain, seed, hardware, and mail. The pilot house became an office where deeds were copied lawfully and posted publicly. A loading platform was built where the gangway met the revived bank. Traders returned. Farmers returned. Wagons lined up beneath the shadow of the stacks. Children who had known the vessel only as a haunted carcass now ran laughing over planks scrubbed clean and warm with sun.as for Croft. The court stripped him piece by piece. Lands taken through fraud were restored where possible or compensated where time had made restoration impossible. The officials who had aided him fell with him. He lived long enough to see other men plow fields he had once claimed with a pen and a lie, and perhaps that was fitting. Some punishments are loud and dramatic. Others are made of witnessing the survival of those one tried to erase. Years later, travelers would ask how a stranded steamship came to stand at the center of the basin's trade. An old resident would smile before answering, because the truth sounded too much like a tale to belong to ordinary records. But perhaps that is how truth often survives on the frontier. It passes first through ledgers and courts, yes, but then it keeps living in the mouth, the memory, the shared telling at dusk when lamps are lit and the wind moves over water that was once believed gone forever. And so when we think of Evelyn Vance, we do not think first of the gold, though it was real, nor of the court victory, though it mattered, nor even of the river returning, though that sight would have been enough for one life. We think of a young woman standing before a thing the whole world had written off as ruin, and refusing the judgment. We think of hands dirty with soot and dust, guided by lessons given in love long before they were needed. We think of how the earth keeps its own hidden records when men falsify paper ones, how iron remembers, how riverbeds remember, how sealed compartments and forgotten levers and old survey marks wait in patience for someone honest enough to read them. The valley had called the Iron Monarch a corpse. Evelyn looked at the same wreck and saw a witness. Others saw trash, scrap, hazard, madness. She saw a locked testimony with heat in its bones still, and because she saw it, a dead basin learned to hear water again. That is the quiet miracle inside so many human stories, and perhaps inside our own as well. Hope does not always arrive bright and obvious, carrying banners and singing its intentions. Sometimes it stands stranded in plain sight under years of ridicule. Sometimes it groans in the wind through broken wheels. Sometimes it smells of rust and old ash and sun-baked pine. Sometimes it asks us to climb inside what frightens or embarrasses everyone else, to trust that what has been abandoned may still contain the map back to life. Evelyn did not restore the valley by dreaming prettier dreams than other people. She restored it by looking steadily at what remained, by listening to metal, by reading hidden lines, by keeping faith with her father's unfinished warning and her own stubborn sense that truth can be buried but not abolished. The river came back, yes, but before the river, there came that smaller return, the one on which all larger returns depend, a person's refusal to let despair have the final interpretation of what is broken. Thank you for spending this time with us in the dry river basin. What is a time you found value or hope in something others had completely written off? Until next time, stay close.